thousands in field and cities across that part of the world were ill. Some began to suspect the deaths were brought about because of the wrath of God. And in one of the cities of Germany, Lubeck, they determined that they needed to do something to appeal to God for forgiveness. So they began to bring enormous amounts of money, jewels, and other riches to churches and monasteries in the area. But there was one monastery that didn't want their offerings. The monks and priests of that monastery were convinced that the money was contaminated with whatever had spread the plague. So they barred their gates and refused to allow the citizens to enter. But the people were frantic. So they picked up their valuables, their coins, the gold and jewels, and threw them over the walls. But the monks didn't want this wealth, so they threw them back. And the citizens threw them back inside. And the monks threw them back outside. And this continued for hours. Riches were tossed back and forth until the clergy finally gave up and allowed the riches to remain inside the gate. Within hours, the piles 3 to 4 feet high filled the monastery courtyard for months following that incident. And some say for years, actually, the money remained untouched. The source of this was from More Fascinating Facts by David Lewis. The monks and priests at the monastery believed this wealth would harm them. They believed these great riches would destroy them. And that was pretty much what Jesus warned his disciples about also in Luke 12:15. Take care and be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. This is a recurring theme in Scripture, and Paul wrote to Timothy in the 1 Timothy 6:9, those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmless desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. Job said in Job 31:24-25 and verse 28, if I have made gold my trust, or called my fine gold my confidence, if I have rejoiced because of my wealth was abundant, or because my hand had found much, I would have been false to God above. Now that's not to say that being rich is a bad thing. Throughout the Old Testament, God blessed many who loved him with wealth. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, David, Solomon, and others. They were all wealthy men. In fact, God implied that if Israel obeyed him, they would be a wealthy nation. In Deuteronomy 8:11 following, it says, take care lest you forget the Lord your God, by not keeping his commandments and his rules and his statutes, which I command you today. Lest when you have eaten and are full and have built good houses and live in them, and when your herds and flocks multiply, and your silver and gold is multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, then your heart be lifted up, and you forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. So you see, the problem is not wealth. The problem is when wealth takes control of people's and it causes them to forget God. Psalm 10:3 tells us, the one greedy for gain curses and renounces the Lord. So that brings us to the text for this morning. There's a man who wants Jesus to settle a family dispute. Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. Now that was a normal thing back then. William Barclay, a commentator, said it is not uncommon for people in Palestine to take their unsettled disputes to their rabbis. But Jesus refused to be mixed up in anyone's dispute about money. But now why wouldn't Jesus do that? Why wouldn't he get mixed up in this argument between these two brothers? Well, because the problem, as with many disputes over inheritance, had to do with greed and covetousness. I've known brothers and sisters who hate each other and have never talked to each other because they didn't get what they wanted when a parent died. It's happened in my own family. I've even heard of a family where brothers cheated their sisters out of a farm, and it created a conflict that was never resolved. And they were all Christians. You see, an inheritance often brings about the worst in people because there are people who love their riches more than they love their relatives. So Jesus rightly turns down this greedy family member and launches him into a lesson about covetousness. Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness. So to illustrate the point, Jesus tells them a parable about a wealthy man who had been blessed with a bumper crop. So he decided to tear down his old barns and build new and bigger ones for all the excess. Now there is nothing wrong with a farmer having a good harvest. No, it's not a bad thing. And was there anything wrong with building bigger barns? Well, not really. So what was wrong with what the guy was doing? Well, Jesus shared with that wealthy man, I will say to my soul, you have a good example. You have good goods laid up for many years. Now you can relax and drink and be merry. But God said to him, fool, this night your soul is required of you. And the things that you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. So what was wrong? Well, the man's first thoughts were about himself. I will say to my soul, you have ample goods, laid up for many years, so relax. Eat and drink and be merry. It was all about him. In fact, if you went through this parable, you would find of the 54 words in the parable in the original Greek, totally 18 of them were in the first person, words like I and me and mine. God and what God wanted of him wasn't even on this guy's mind. Some time ago, the news was filled with stories about a Mega Million lottery that was coming up and the Powerball lotteries. And on Facebook, someone asked, leaving out the reference to lotteries at all, what would you do if someone suddenly gave you $50 million? I was intrigued by the answers that people gave. They wrote about how they'd, pay off their debts, go on a cruise or some special vacation, how they'd buy a better house or a better car, or maybe get to take care of their parents or set aside a trust fund for their kids. And that was all good stuff. But what I found interesting that no one seemed to mention God. Nobody talked about how they'd spend any part of that vast amount of money for missions, for helping the poor, or giving to the church. None of that came up. God and what he would want for them wasn't even on their mind. Now, it didn't really matter because the money in this situation, it wasn't real. None of those folks had ever received the 50 million, nor were they likely to at all. It was just kind of a game thing or asking of a question. But in that game, they revealed their priorities. When they let their imaginations run wild, God didn't even show up in their thoughts. I mean, it's not likely that any of this money, they were going to get it anyway. But if they could have given all that 50 million to God, they wouldn't have been out a dime because there really was no money involved. It was all imaginary. But their first thoughts were all about themselves. I, me, mine, and myself. Just like the rich fool. So even without the presence of millions of dollars in their bank accounts, God doesn't show up in a lot of people's financial thinking. I ran across a cute little poem a few years ago. It's not what you do with $1 million, if $1 million were your lot. It's what you are doing at present with the dollar and the quarter you got. The Bible repeatedly teaches on this point. If we look to Proverbs 3:9-10, it says, honor the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruits of all your produce. Then your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will be bursting with wine. The rich fool forgot about that. He didn't honor God with the first fruits because all he could think of was himself, not God. But why was this? Why would the rich fool forget God? Well, the rest of Jesus' teaching tells us why. Do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, about your body, what you will put on. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. Consider the ravens, they neither sow nor reap. They have neither storehouses nor barn, and yet God feeds them. Oh, how much more value are you than these birds? You see, the rich fool wasn't rich towards God because he was afraid. He was afraid. And that's the reason a lot of Christians don't honor God with finances. They're afraid. They're afraid that God isn't going to take care of them. And so they get anxious. They worry about what they're going to eat. They worry about how they're going to have clothing, where they're going to live. Money is the one place where many of us Christians struggle with our faith. We're not sure we can trust God enough to really take care of our needs. Money is the gauge of our faith, and it often reflects by how much we put in the offering plate or how much we help the poor or give to missions. Now, oddly enough, the one group that struggles the most on this are the rich. I have a friend who is a pastor, and he tells of a relative of his who belongs to his church that he serves. The relative is fairly wealthy and often brags about the fact that he gives a great deal to the church. But my friend tells me he's watched this relative put money in the plate and knows this wealthy older man usually only puts $10 or $20 in. But there's an unusual prayer in Proverbs 38-9. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with food that is needed for me, lest I be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Or lest I be poor and steal the profane the name of my God. So the rich tend to trust their money, their possessions, and their 401ks. And too often they're the ones who put 5, 10, or 20 in the plate. That's if they feel generous. They have lots of money, but they just don't give it to God. But now, wait a minute. Don't the rich have more money than the poor? Well, yes, they do. That's part of the definition of being rich. But they have different priorities about how they spend it. Many years ago, we bought a water purifier for under the kitchen sink from a company locally. But that company eventually was bought out by a bigger company, which was in a larger, wealthier city many miles away. And over time, the bladder for the purifier needed to be replaced, so we called this new company to send a repairman. And the repairman was working under the sink, and I spent some time talking with him. I noted that his company must prefer doing jobs in the larger city where they have a couple of car companies and large battery-making companies compared to this small city. That big city must be a better market for them. And he said, no. We would much rather do business here in Renville. I was surprised and asked him why, and he responded that even though people tend to make more money in the larger city, they had their problems. They'd often buy homes in rich subdivisions. Then they'd notice that the car in their neighbor's driveway was better than theirs, so they had to buy a new one, or a better one. They'd see a boat at the neighbor's and decide they needed one too. And on it would go until they were so far in debt that they had to work overtime to make the payments on their loans. Oftentimes, certain debts would go unpaid. Debts like the one to our company. They much preferred doing business in Renville. People here paid their bills. Jesus gives us a priority when he quotes the rich fool in Luke 12:19. I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for you for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. So what was the goal of the rich man? He wanted to relax. He wanted to enjoy the good life. And that's what often happens when people cling to money. They're driven to enjoy the good life, but not the God life. So they end up trusting in their money, their possessions, and their 401ks. I think maybe the rich fool went to church. I'm sure he attended the temple and the synagogue. But he didn't trust God. So why was that? Well, if you pull out your wallet and say, look at some bills, you can see it and say, oh, I can count this. I can tally up the amount of money I have in the savings and the checking and other accounts. But I can't see God. I can't see God. But I can see and touch my money. It's easier to trust what you and I can see. And that's what happens to too many of us as churchgoers. We can't see God, so he's not quite real to us. I mean, they'll go through the motions of church, singing, praying, communion, sermon. But it's all a matter of doing church. They've done their religious duty because they don't think much about God, because he's just not there. And thus, because he's not quite real, they don't really believe God will be there for them. And they end up worshiping their money, but they actually pay a terrible price. There's a book called Money Madness that observes, for those who devote themselves to money, money seems to eat them away, inside out. Inside they lose their joy and spontaneity and generosity of impulse. Outside they seem to wither, to become pale and drawn and fragile looking.